In 1996, Marlen Perez left Cuba as a refugee. What she thought would be a straightforward journey to join her husband in the U.S. turned into an 8-year ordeal. Here is Marlen's story.
In the 1990s, in Cuba, there was a severe economic crisis. So we started thinking around that time about leaving the country. Plus, I was a defense attorney, and I was having some trouble, some problems at work, and we decided to leave the country together. I mean, me, my husband, and my daughter, who was 2 years old. And the time came, and he has this boat and this idea how to go from Cuba to Miami. My daughter was very sick, and so I started worrying about living with him, and we made the agreement so he will come first, and we're going to stay there until he will be able to bring us to the United States.
The trip did not go as planned. In 1994, Marlen's husband Jose was picked up by the Coast Guard and taken to Guantanamo Bay, where he was detained for a year. Since 1994, the U.S. has instituted a wet foot, dry foot policy where Cubans who reach American soil are allowed to remain legally. Those like Jose, detained on the open sea, are sent back to Cuba. But Marlen's husband was eventually accepted as a refugee to the United States and resettled to Nashville by Catholic Charities in 1995. Marlen hoped Jose could apply for family reunification so they could come to Nashville, but both her and her husband's efforts failed.
I think I got discouraged about coming here. So many obstacles. I mean, it was almost impossible legally to come straight from Cuba to United States.
Marlen decided the only way she could leave Cuba and reunite her family was to cross the Mexican-U.S. border and make her way to Nashville. She arranged to leave Cuba and fly to Venezuela. From there, she and her daughter would cross into Mexico and make their way to the border.
I didn't have no real idea how dangerous is coming to the Mexican border. There was a boy, a little teenage boy, I think he was 10 years old, Mexican boy, who was in charge of the crossing. And it was a group of people. My child was the only child. And there was like 8-10 men and 2 women. We had to walk like 12-14 hours to get to the river. So they put like everyone in an inner tube, and someone pulled the inner tube from the other side.
Marlen and the group she was traveling with successfully made it across the U.S. border. And for Marlen, as a Cuban fleeing persecution and seeking refugee status, this should have set her on a clear path to obtaining legal residency. But she and her group were eventually detained by immigration officials at a bus station and sent to a detention center. And in Texas, immigration officers were not as familiar with Cuban-U.S. immigration policies as in major destinations like Miami, Florida.
In Miami, they know for sure what to do when a Cuban arrived to Miami. But in Texas, was very different. So they ask a lot of questions. And then like in the middle of the night, they allow my daughter and me to leave. I got these papers and my promise to immigration that I will be in court whenever they decide to set the hearing. But now I know what was going on. I didn't have no idea about the papers. The papers were in English, so it was very confusing.
From Texas, Marlen and her daughter traveled by bus to Miami, not knowing it wasn't on the way to Tennessee. From Miami, she was finally able to call her husband, who had no idea she was in the country.
The only words I said, "We here." He said, "Here where?" I said, "We're here in the United States." And he said, "How come?" I said, "We just got here." That was it.
Marlen's husband drove to Miami to bring them home to Nashville.
And it was very weird. My daughter didn't know that was her father. I mean, really didn't know him. And when she saw him, she vomited. And it was it was quite a surprise to come here.
Marlen's arrival in Nashville wasn't the end of her troubles. Because of her detention in Texas, she was required to return every 6 months to a federal court in San Antonio until her legal status was resolved. She tried to move her court visits to Memphis, but her pleas were refused. After following some bad legal advice, Marlen missed one of her court visits in San Antonio. Because she didn't make her assigned court appointment, the federal judge in Texas placed a deportation order on Marlen's file.
I got this order in the mail saying that I had to be removed to Cuba. That is when the trouble, really trouble, started.
For the next 8 years, Marlen lived with the constant fear that she could be removed from the U.S. and her family.
I remember in those 8 years, I never drove from one place to my home straight to my house. I would go past my house and look if there was any car, any van, white van, and the parking, and the driveway, and come back. I always had very, very present in my mind that they can come and to pick me up. I remember having nightmares about having to go back. And I wanted to go back anywhere but Cuba. It was like the United States became my big jail.
One reason Marlen wasn't deported was because she was Cuban. The United States has not had a formal diplomatic relationship with Cuba since the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and there was no other country to send her to from the U.S. But for Marlen, the fear remained, and the frustration that if she had arrived in Florida instead of Texas, she likely would have been granted asylum like her husband and been on a solid path to citizenship.
It is weird. In the beginning, I put a lot of blame on me. I mean, what I did. If I'm an attorney, I should know that you don't miss a court date. And then as I learned how immigration laws are complicated, and that even attorneys here, they don't know the full impact. I mean, you have the same case, if it's handled in Florida, will be very different. The outcomes are compared to Tennessee. I mean, the same law applies to everybody, but in a different way. So it depends who is the officer who is taking your file and is reading through it. So it's so complicated because not everybody knows what to do. Looking back, I never fully enjoyed being in this country because of that. And I think my husband helped me a lot. When I was close to get everything fixed, and I said to myself, well, if I had to go back to Cuba, I'd go. And then at the end, United States is not the end of the world, then I will go.
After 8 years, Marlen was able to remove the deportation order, obtain permanent residency, and pursue citizenship. But her experiences living undocumented continued to impact her life and work.
I feel very passionate about Nashville. And when I talk about Nashville, it's like I'm talking about my city. And I would say that changed when I resolved this immigration issues. But before that, I never had the sense that I belong to this place. Now I can say that I feel more connected to Nashville than even to my home country. Because now I see I'm gonna be here and I'm gonna live here for, I guess, forever.
Today, Marlen works as a mental health caseworker. Some of her patients are living without documents, and Marlen feels her experiences help her understand the unique tensions some of her patients face.
I can understand them better than anybody else. Sometimes I have patients to tell me, you don't know what it is to be with no documents. And the only thing I say, believe me, I know what it is to be. I know what you're feeling.
Marlen's work also keeps her attuned to the situation undocumented people live with on a daily basis in Nashville, and she notices changes.
I would say 4 or 5 years ago, the pressure of having to have the need for legal status. It was not as big as it is right now. For example, in people that I see every day, that in the beginning, like 2-3 years ago, they were more optimistic, more hopeful, and many bought houses, and you can see the idea for them was to stay here and have a family here and not going back. And now more and more and more people already living or making plans to live. So that changed your mind and the way you think, the way you act. If you know you are not gonna be here for a long time, you don't do the same thing, or you don't think the same way as you see this is as your destination. So many of my patients already left, or many are being forced to leave because the deportation, or almost every family I see has someone that has been deported. And they start getting ready in case they had to leave.